So in the last video, we saw that Kant thinks a necessary condition for an action to be morally praiseworthy is that it is motivated or stems from a categorical imperative. In this video, we'll move towards a sufficient condition for an action being morally praiseworthy. Okay, so here's what Kant calls the categorical imperative. This is what he thinks is the fundamental rule of morality. As I mentioned last time, he thinks you can phrase this a few different ways, but this he thinks is one of the basic phrasings. So here's what it says. Only act on a rule if you can will it to be a universal law. So what does that mean? Well, you could think of it like a test. If you want to know if an action is morally praiseworthy, morally blameworthy, bad, or morally neutral, it's neither praiseworthy nor blameworthy, that's amoral, then ask yourself this: can I will that everyone follow this rule? So think of the rule that you're following and ask yourself, can I will that everyone follow it? If your answer is no, you can't will that everyone follow it, that it's just inconceivable to imagine everybody following that rule, then the action is immoral. It's morally blameworthy, and the opposite of the action is morally praiseworthy. So, for example, if you try and imagine, and we'll explain why it is you might not be able to imagine this, but suppose you try and imagine everybody following the rule steal everything all the time, then, or steal whenever you want to, or something like that. And suppose you just can't imagine everybody following that rule. Then following that rule is immoral. And following the opposite, like I'm motivated in this case by the rule don't steal, is morally praiseworthy. If your answer is yes, you can will that everyone follow the rule, then the action that you're considering performing is either morally praiseworthy or amoral. It's morally neutral. It's neither praiseworthy nor blameworthy. So consider an example. Suppose I'm considering following the rule, if I want a cake, then follow the recipe. Well, you might think it's pretty easy to imagine everybody following that rule, but that doesn't mean the action is morally praiseworthy. It's just neutral. It's not a big deal if you're motivated by that rule. Of course, that rule itself can't motivate you, but set that aside. Okay, so what does it mean to say that you can or can't will that everyone follow a rule? Well, it's important to get this straight. Start with the word can. There's a variety of different ways this word gets used in ordinary language. You might think of these as different kinds of can. So there's the can of psychology. Here you can ask, for example, can I love a murderer? And the question is something like, given the constraints of my own mind, can I love a murderer? Or can I come to hate my child? Or something like that. Given the constraints of how my psychology works, can I manage to do that? Can I will that my child die? And you might think, that you can't will your child to die, you can love a murderer, whatever. The constraint that can is trying to capture here are constraints of your own sort of psychology. And we're not interested in that kind of can. What about the can of nature? Here you might ask, can pigs fly? And you might say, no, they can't. Can I will that everyone be as wealthy as Bill Gates? And you might say, well, no, I can't, because if everyone is wealthy, had as much money in the bank as Bill Gates has in the bank, then there would be skyrocketing inflation and people would no longer be as wealthy as Bill Gates. So as a matter of fact, I can't will that. That's because of limited resources. That's why you get the inflation and so on. That's not the kind of can we're interested in either. We're interested in something closer to what you might call the can of logic or the can of semantics. And here you can ask, can a square be round? And can I will that I'm the tallest and the shortest person in the world? And what I want you to notice is, even compared to, can pigs fly, you might think there's a sense in which you can at least imagine pigs flying. Even though they can't, it's at least a coherent thought. Pigs can fly. You sort of picture in your mind's eye a pig flying around. But you can't picture in your mind's eye a round square. And you can't picture in your mind's eye that you're simultaneously both the shortest and tallest person in the world, at least presuming that there's other people around. Okay. That's the kind of can that we're interested in when we say, can I will that everyone follow this rule? We're asking, is it even coherent or imaginable for everyone to follow the rule? So let's consider some examples now. Suppose George promises Jane that he will pay her back, but he knows that he's not going to do it. Okay? He acts from the following principle. If you benefit from a false promise, then falsely promise. And what we're interested in is this action morally blameworthy? And let's say intuitively we think it is morally blameworthy. That is, it's morally blameworthy if you follow the principle, if you can benefit from a false promise, then do it. So what we want to do is see how this principle tells us that it is morally blameworthy. If this is the right principle, then it should tell us this action is morally blameworthy. And you can think of this as a test for a principle. We'll call it the contradiction test. So if the action, when you imagine everybody, if the rule, when you imagine everybody following it, leads to a contradiction, that is, leads to some incoherence, then it's not possible to imagine everybody following it because contradictions can't be true. So let's apply this kind of contradiction test, and you'll see how it works as we apply it to see if George's action is moral. So can George will that everyone follow this principle that says if you can benefit from a false promise, then do it? Well, here's Kant's idea. If everyone follows this principle, then no one will take a promise seriously. But you can only follow the principle if someone takes a promise seriously. So the idea is, suppose everybody is always following the principle. If you're going to benefit from lying, then go ahead and lie. Well, it won't be long before nobody takes a promise seriously. When you promise me something, I'll be like, yeah, whatever. I know people don't keep their promises. Now, I can only follow this principle if someone takes a promise seriously. Why is that? Because I'm only promising if you're actually taking me seriously. If you don't take me seriously at all, it's not really a promise. So suppose I jokingly say, like, I promise to win the lottery for you. Well, because I know you're not going to take that seriously, it's not really a promise. I haven't like failed to live up to my obligation and meet what I promised if I don't win the lottery. Because when I said it, everybody knew it was kind of not serious, right? And the way you know it's not serious is because you know that I can't sort of choose just to, no matter how I work to win the lottery. The idea here is that if everybody knows that what you're saying is not really a promise, then it's not a promise. So it follows that if you can only follow the rule at issue, which requires that you promise, if someone takes a promise seriously. Well, given that if everyone follows the rule, then no one takes a promise seriously, and you can follow the rule only if someone takes a promise seriously, then if everyone follows the rule, no one takes a promise seriously, but somebody must take a promise seriously. Otherwise, by two, you can't follow the rule. So if everybody follows this rule, we get a contradiction. The contradiction is that no one takes a promise seriously and someone takes a promise seriously. Well, remember, if we get a contradiction when we imagine everybody following a rule, then following that rule is immoral, and following the opposite of the rule is morally praiseworthy. So George can't will that everyone follow P, and that means it's immoral to follow P. Now let's look at a case of a moral action. Suppose George doesn't steal a watch because he applies this rule. Never steal. No matter what, never steal. Now let's apply the contradiction test to see if George's action is morally praiseworthy. Can George will that everyone follow the opposite of this rule? Well, what's the opposite? Well, the negation of the rule is just not the case that you never steal. So that would be like you sometimes steal. We're interested in something closer to an intuitive opposite. So the intuitive opposite of never steal is always steal. So can George will that everyone follow the opposite of this rule? That is, that everybody follows the rule always steal? Well, if everyone always steals, then there's going to be no ownership. The idea is that very quickly everything I possess will be something I've stolen, and if I've stolen it, I don't own it. Well, you can only steal something that's owned. If something's unowned and you take it, you're not stealing it, you're just acquiring it. Well, if everyone always steals, there's no ownership, but you can only steal if there is ownership, and in order to follow the rule, always steal, you need to be able to steal. So if everyone always steals, then by one, there's no ownership, and by two, there is ownership, because people are following the rule, always steal, and in order to steal, there has to be ownership. So if everyone always steals, we get a contradiction, that there is no ownership and that there is ownership. So you can't will that everyone follows the rule, always steal. That is the opposite of the rule, never steal. So applying that rule, never steal, is morally praiseworthy. Now, how about an amoral action? Well, suppose George acts from the following principles. If you want to be healthy, then exercise. If you want to exercise, then go to the gym. Now let's apply the contradiction test to see if George's action is immoral. Can George will that everybody follow these rules? Well, the answer is yes. Now, notice it may be the case that there's not enough gyms around or something like that. But that doesn't mean that it's incoherent to imagine everybody going to the gym, because you can imagine that there's more gyms around. Remember, to get the contradiction, it has to be that you can't even imagine everybody following the principle. And in this case, it looks like you can imagine everybody following these principles. Now, how about the opposite of the principle? Well, you can imagine, following the opposite of the principle also doesn't lead to a contradiction. So what would the opposite of the principle be? It would be something like, I don't know, there's a few different ways you could formulate it, but if you don't want to be healthy, then don't exercise. If you don't want to exercise, then don't go to the gym. Can you imagine everybody following that? Yes. So it looks like the principle is neither morally, following these principles is neither morally praiseworthy nor morally blameworthy. It's morally neutral, which is to say it's amoral. Now, let's see, now we have three different kinds of action. We have immoral actions, which are those that follow rules that lead to a contradiction when universalized, when you imagine everybody following them. There are moral actions, morally praiseworthy actions. Those are ones that follow rules that are categorical and that lead to a contradiction when the opposite is universalized. And there are amoral actions. Those are ones that follow rules that don't lead to a contradiction when universalized and don't lead to a contradiction when the opposite is universalized. Okay, so when you ask, can I will that everyone follow this rule? You're supposed to answer no, if and only if imagining everybody follow the rule yields a contradiction. If imagining everybody following the rule yields a contradiction, then you can't will it to be universal. That is, you can't will everyone to follow it. So we get the statement, you should only act on a rule if you can imagine it to be something everybody follows, if you can imagine it to be universally followed, if you can imagine it to be a universal law. Okay, so that takes us through the vast majority of Kant's theory. How might you object to this theory? Well, there's a variety of ways you can object, and we'll look at an objection from Mill when we talk about Mill. I'm just going to give you a case, and you can think about it. So here's the case. This is kind of standard objection to Kant's view. So take a rule like the never falsely promise. So Kant thinks that if you imagine everybody following the opposite of that rule, that is, everybody following the rule always falsely promise, you get to a contradiction, which means following the rule never falsely promise is morally praiseworthy, and following the rule like if it will help you get what you want, then falsely promise is morally blameworthy. And he thinks that's a general rule and it's exceptionless. Well, imagine that you're hiding some Jewish people in your attic, and you're a German. It's during World War II or in the lead up to World War II, and you know that the Nazi party is coming around and collecting Jewish people and sending them off to camps. You don't know exactly what goes on in these camps, but you've heard that the people get killed. So you're hiding these Jewish people. And a Nazi soldier knocks on your door and says, are you hiding any Jewish people? It looks like Kant's theory would say this: follow the rule, never falsely promise. That's always morally praiseworthy. So your action is morally praiseworthy if you say to the Nazi soldier, yes, I'm hiding some Jewish people in my attic. And your action is morally blameworthy if you say, no, I'm not, because then you're following the rule. If it will help me get what I want, then falsely promise. And following that rule is always morally blameworthy. So it looks like it's morally good to tell the Nazis that you're hiding the Jewish people, and morally bad to tell the Nazis that you're not. And this reflects a general concern about Kant's moral theory, which is it makes moral goodness and moral badness sort of all about your personal moral hygiene, rather than about the effects that your actions have on other people. And that will be the jumping off point that John Stuart Mill uses to argue that, in fact, moral worth doesn't come from the rule that you're following, but instead comes from the end that your action achieves. And we'll stop there.